I just have to make the disclaimer before we begin this video. Due to YouTube's blacklisting of certain words, I'm going to have to be muting out certain trigger words. Okay, I told you. Now we can continue. I really want to sit down with you today to talk about the life of Janis Joplin, and more importantly, do a full-blown deep dive into her psyche and the truth about who she was as a person. What most people think about when they hear Janis Joplin's name, unfortunately, is her untimely death, her heavy abuse, and reported promiscuity. But there's so much more to understand about her life. Janis Joplin was born in Port Arthur, Texas, on January 19th, 1943. She was born Janis Lynn Joplin. She was born to her father, Seth, and her mother, Dorothy. Seth had a great job. He worked as an engineer at Texaco, and her mother, Dorothy, worked as a registrar at a local business college. Her mom also taught Sunday school at their church on the weekends, where Janis would sing in the choir, like everyone else that we know. Soon after Janis was born, the Joplin home burned down, and her parents were forced to rent another home. Their second home would be where Janis spent the majority of her childhood. It was a modest home located at 3130 Lombardy in Griffin Park. If you Google it today, though, the address is 4330 32nd Street in Port Arthur, because in 1982, Griffin Park consolidated with the city of Port Arthur, and everything got moved around and renamed and changed. For the first few years of Janis's life, her parents rented their home in a rent-to-own situation. On August 19th, 1947, the Joplins purchased the property and called it their forever home. In fact, Janis and her sister at one point carved their names into the cement in the backyard of this home, and you can still see it there to this day because the home is still standing. It is, I'll say is because it's still there. It's 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, single level, and it actually just sold in 2017 for about $150,000. And Janis had a typical upbringing here. She went to Tyrell Elementary School. I actually found this photo of her from a Christmas pageant the school had in 1952, and Janis is the little girl in the bottom right-hand corner, if you couldn't guess who she was. And it was either junior high or high school, it was probably high school, where Janis was first introduced to a novelist who would really change her perspective on the world and on herself, I think, forever. The school required Janis Joplin to read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And while most children in the school just read the book, did the essay, and carried on with their lives, this really had an impact on Janis Joplin. And it put her into this F. Scott Fitzgerald rabbit hole that she never really got out of. She started looking into F. Scott Fitzgerald's life and became totally overwhelmed by his love affair with Zelda.
Do you know about F. Scott Fitzgerald? I mean, were you ever F. Scott Fitzgerald freak? Yeah, well, I've been an F. Scott Fitzgerald freak for years, and Zelda just came out, and you ought to read it. She was something else.
Now, I have to tell you the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda in order for you to appreciate who Janis Joplin became, because I believe the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda had such an important impact on her as a high school student, and it's something she talked about or brought up in almost every interview she ever gave, was the love affair between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. And I think she, in a way, glamorized their love affair and glamorized their life in a way that ultimately made her live out her own twisted love affairs herself. So I have to tell this story. It's imperative to the integrity of who Janis Joplin was. So if you want to skip ahead, the video will have chapters and you can skip to the next chapter at the play bar below if you already know the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, or if you don't want to hear it from me, but I am going to tell it. F. Scott Fitzgerald fell in love with 18-year-old Zelda Sayer in 1918 when Zelda was just 18 years old. He was 22, I think. And the two of them had an instant connection. But Fitzgerald was ready to go overseas with the army right after meeting Zelda. So he gave Zelda the information to write to him while he was gone. And the two of them embarked on what has now become a very famous love letter frenzy. Zelda's mother was really not having this romance. She continually gave Zelda newspaper clippings about how writers don't make any money and how the majority of them fail at their craft, making it known to Zelda that if she wanted to have a stable life with a stable husband who could provide for her, dating a writer was not the way to do it. And Zelda, by the way, was the daughter of a very well-known judge, so her family was indeed educated and well-known in the community, and they genuinely just wanted the best life for her. After Fitzgerald came back to New York City from being overseas, Zelda told him she wasn't going to marry him unless he could prove to her that he could provide for a family and be financially stable with a career in writing. Fitzgerald took on this challenge. Once he proved to Zelda he was a serious writer and that he could make money doing it, she finally agreed to marry him in 1920. But keep in mind, Zelda was a socialite. Her father was a judge on the Alabama Supreme Court, and she started using her socialite status as a way to promote her husband's work. She would give him really good, funny, witty reviews, and once F. Scott Fitzgerald released his first novel and the money started coming in, he and Zelda became more and more extravagant and lavish. Zelda and Fitzgerald were already heavy partiers before the money started flowing in, but once they started receiving all of these big checks from Fitzgerald's novels, they started spending it like crazy. They bought expensive houses, expensive decor. They started hosting expensive dinners full of dancing and drinking, always ending with the men in the library smoking cigars and the women having coffee in the kitchen. You know how those fancy parties go. But one of the biggest downfalls for them, as is the case with many people, is that they started spending their money faster than it was coming in. By 1924, they started experiencing some severe financial stress. Fitzgerald started working long hours trying to write more and more novels, trying to make more and more money for him and Zelda, and the two of them decided to move to France, where Fitzgerald could have a French oasis to focus on his writing. But moving to Europe was expensive, and nesting in Europe was very expensive. Zelda was spending gobs of money on furniture and decor, you name it. And this started to create a lot of anxiety for both Fitzgerald and Zelda. Obviously, they did this to themselves. No external factor was forcing them to blow through money, but yet here they were struggling to put food on the table because they'd put themselves in so much debt. Zelda tried to distract herself with ballet, and she'd famously practice ballet until her feet were bleeding and she was physically and mentally exhausted. So Fitzgerald is off isolating himself from the marriage, trying to write novels to make money. Zelda is off isolating herself from the marriage, exhausting herself doing ballet. Neither of them are actually sitting down and coming up with a plan on how they're going to get out of this debt. Neither of them are talking about making changes to their quality of life or spending habits. In fact, when they weren't isolated from each other, they were drinking or doing other kinds of things that would impact their mental state and avoiding the issues at hand. Now, lucky for them, Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby in 1925, and in came a whole other stream of income. But along with this new stream of income also came a significant increase in spending. One of their favorite pastimes as a couple was going out in France and having lavish dinners and drinking until 2 or 3 a.m. These alcohol-fueled nights would always result in the two of them having crazy outbursts, commonly in public for everyone to see. It was like all of their stressors and issues came out in this incredibly toxic, drunken way, rather than the two of them just sitting down and talking about it with two level heads. And this absolutely threw Zelda into a total downward spiral of confusion, frustration, and an overwhelming feeling like she was losing control of everything and everyone around her. It was in 1930 in France, Zelda finally cracked and had a full-blown mental breakdown. She was taken to a clinic in Paris where they diagnosed her with schizophrenia. Now, this diagnosis was a total shock to both of them because Zelda never had mental health issues in her childhood or her early adolescence. Her decline in mental health really seemed to be associated with her marriage with Fitzgerald and their inabilities to cope with life's curveballs. It certainly didn't seem like Zelda had schizophrenia, and many scholars testify they believe this diagnosis simply reflected the limited understanding of mental health conditions at that time. But regardless, she gets this diagnosis and then embarks on several years of trying to self-medicate and deal with this thing that's wrong with her. She became severely agitated and confused over the next few years, and Fitzgerald tried to be there for her, but he also didn't have the necessary skills to deal with someone going through something like this. I mean, most people don't, and this just led Fitzgerald to further isolate himself and drink more and more. From 1930 to 1937, I think, Fitzgerald was hospitalized 8 or 9 times for his drinking. And the two of them never formally divorced, but much of their marriage ended up being spent apart. Fitzgerald ended up going to Hollywood, and Zelda remained in a mental institution for many, many years. And famously, the love letters between them continued. And this is part of the reason their letters to each other are so famous, because you can see their entire love affair play out letter by letter, virtually from the time they met, when Fitzgerald was in the army overseas, when Zelda's 18 and he's 22 and they're not even married yet. You can read those letters, and you can read their letters to each other all the way up through the 1940s, through when Zelda is in a mental institution and Fitzgerald is in Hollywood. And it's in those letters later in their lives in the 1940s that you see Fitzgerald trying to show her emotional support and trying to continue to love a woman who is so broken and lost and confined. But it's also known that he was having several affairs during this time. A lot of them were not obviously officially confirmed, but people knew they were happening, and there was one that ended up being very public towards the end of his life. And I genuinely do feel as though those who do not live peaceful lives also don't really experience peaceful deaths. Some of the time. Most of the time. I mean, I've seen it several times, let me put it that way. And remarkably, this seems to be the case with F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. Fitzgerald ended up dying of a heart attack at just 44 years old, and then he was denied the ability to be buried with his family in the family cemetery. He ended up having to be buried alone elsewhere. And a few years after his death, Zelda, who had been at a mental institution in North Carolina, was given the opportunity to go home and be released from the institution. She decided she wanted to err on the side of caution, and she wanted to stay a few more days in the hospital. Now, if she had chosen not to do this, if she had taken the opportunity to be released, she never would have died, because just a few days later, a fire broke out there, and all of the patients were burned to death, including Zelda. And you might be asking, why didn't they just escape the fire? Why didn't they just leave? But they couldn't, because the mental institution had chained and locked all the doors and windows, trying to keep all of the patients inside. So now Janis is going down that rabbit hole, okay? She's reading about this love affair between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. And she's reading all of the letters between the two of them, the letters from when they first met all the way up through Zelda being in a mental institution. And in all of her interviews, not all of her interviews, but in a lot of her interviews, and a theme that kept coming up over and over again for Janis Joplin was this theme of, we're destroying ourselves. We are our own enemy. And that comes directly from a letter F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote to Zelda, where he said to her, people think that we destroyed each other, but the truth is, my dear, that we destroyed ourselves. And that line from that letter just hit Janis so hard, and everything about their love affair hit her pretty deeply. And keep in mind, she's reading all of this in high school, and she's reading this love affair and thinking how beautiful it must be to be Zelda, to have a man love you unconditionally. And in a way, she glamorized in her mind Zelda's mental issues and F. Scott Fitzgerald's love. And just to be very clear, by the way, their marriage was very toxic, okay? It's not healthy to blow through money with your husband or to blow through your husband's money. It's not healthy or good to be buying lavish things and spending above your means. Okay, none of that is good, just to make sure we're all on the same page. But Janis Joplin was naive and underdeveloped as she was reading about this. She thought it was beautiful in a lot of ways. Her peers are bullying her pretty heavily. She's reading all of this and ruminating over it before any man had ever given her any type of attention before at all. After her high school literally voted her as ugliest man in the high school yearbook. Janis was overweight compared to everyone else. She also suffered from pretty bad acne and had this thick, wavy hair that she never really took the time to comb or style like the others did. And on top of Janis looking different from everyone else, she was also a very old soul and had a very deep appreciation for literature like The Great Gatsby, like F. Scott Fitzgerald. She wasn't concerned about who was dating who or what was going on after school, and her peers didn't like her for that. And Janis could feel that she was being ostracized and decided to just embrace it. In what almost felt like a big F you to her whole high school and neighborhood and community, Janis started cursing and dressing differently and daydreaming about moving away. As soon as she graduated high school in 1960, Janis started taking classes at the Lamar State College, which was just 30 minutes away from her hometown in Beaumont, Texas. But being just half an hour away wasn't far enough for Janis. So after just 1 year of studying at Lamar, she decided to transfer to the University of California, Berkeley in LA. And she didn't know it, but this was going to be the first of 3 attempts at flying the nest, which I personally think speaks volumes to her resilience. This first move to California meant more than just a fresh start for Janis. It also gave her an overwhelming sense of hope and excitement that maybe she did have a purpose in this life. Maybe she could live out her dreams so that on the day that she did die, she wouldn't be dying as this high school outcast. But moving to LA definitely didn't come without its challenges. Here she is, 19 years old, no education, no skills, in a huge city where she knows absolutely no one, and she chose not to live in a dorm, but to live in apartments instead with different artists. While most students were more concerned with classes and university events, Janis was always far more interested in immersing herself in the artistic subculture of the surrounding Bay Area. She worked odd jobs here and there, but nothing was really long-term enough to give her the financial security she needed in order to sustain a life in LA. So after just 1 year in the city, Janis was forced to move back in with her parents in Texas. And to say this was devastating to Janis would be a total understatement.
Do you ever go back to Port Arthur?
I went back once. It's a bummer. I ain't going back again.
She really felt like her move to LA was going to be it for her. And having to move back to her hometown made her feel like an absolute failure. She enrolled again at Lamar University to study art, almost as if that whole year in LA had never happened. Everything was back to how it had been just 2 years prior. But in this year that she was back home, she saved as much money as she could, focused on her music, and did her best to regroup and prepare for her next attempt to fly the nest. It was in 1963 Janis decided to abandon her art degree altogether and focus on music full-time. This time, she moved to San Francisco, where she immediately immersed herself in the artist scene. And whether she had anticipated this or not, that meant immersing herself in a culture of people who were overfeelers and depressed creatives, and in many instances, straight up alcoholics and addicts. And I think what's so sad for Janis Joplin is that she never experienced the other side of the music industry, because there is another side to all of that. But once you get sucked into that subculture, it is very hard to get out of it. And all she could really think about was the fact she needed to network with these folks. And she felt the pressures of trying to become a staple in the town and build these connections. But a lot of that networking meant having to party with these people into the late night and early hours. Janis, like many artists, and especially new artists on the scene, could not decipher if someone in her crowd had an actual problem, an actual mental illness, or if someone was just generally a bad influence to be around versus someone who was just partying and partaking in activities, but would ultimately be a positive influence in her life. And unfortunately, not being able to decipher this made her feel as though she had to keep up with everyone, do the things they wanted to do, just because she wanted that connection for her own personal success. And that started turning into her wanting to impress these people, not just keep up with them. Which, by the way, just a life note, you never want to impress someone who has an addiction or is an alcoholic or is a really bad influence. You don't want to impress those people. But to Janis, she wanted to impress everyone, and she wanted to be a part of their club. So if they were drinking, she would drink the most. Or if they were using, she would use the most. And before she knew it, she was in this dark vortex of a Bermuda Triangle with no way out. For the next couple of years, she continued to play in small clubs and coffee places in the San Francisco area. Her usage got worse and worse and worse, to the point where people in her network were genuinely worried about her and telling her she should go home and try to regroup and recenter. And Janis listened to them. At 21 years old, Janis went back to Texas and tried to get sober and regroup. She tried to distance herself from music because she thought that the music was the problem, which in a lot of ways, if you've seen my Roots documentary on Alice Cooper did this too. He got into a really bad mental place performing as Alice Cooper. He obviously got mixed up in drugs, alcohol. He wanted to abandon the Alice Cooper character because he blamed his problems on that. But then he realized that you can compartmentalize the rock and roll from the rock and roll lifestyle. That's what Janis was trying to figure out how to do here. For a while, she thought she had to abandon herself from it altogether. But ultimately, she thought, maybe I can be a part of it, still do these things, and still make it. To be honest, I just don't think she had the proper resources back home in Texas to properly regroup and heal. I think she thought she was doing that, but she wasn't. She wasn't actually addressing anything. She didn't actually learn anything in her recovery. Because after about a year at home to regroup, Janis returned to San Francisco in her third attempt to find success. She moved to Haight Street, which I think is really important to note. The Haight-Ashbury district was the epicenter of the hippie movement in 1967. So many young hippies were just flooding this area that it actually created a really intense clash of cultures between the people who had lived on Haight Street prior to all of this and really loved the peace and tranquility of their neighborhood, to all of these young 20 and 30-year-olds moving in, getting drunk, doing everything. It actually became a national issue, and the president was speaking on it, saying, can all of the young hippies just stop, please? Like, this is chaotic. So that's where Janis Joplin moves, is the center of all of that. And a lot of people advertised Haight Street as this spiritual enlightenment. Like, if you moved here, you would be spiritually enlightened. Everyone was very welcoming if you came to Haight Street as an outsider, which, by the way, and I have a very funny personal story about a time that I found myself in a cult on accident, a straight up cult, by the way, that's been on like Dateline, NBC. I met someone and they were like, oh, come to my community thing, and I did, and I didn't know it was a cult until I was there. And it's a really funny story that I tell at dinner parties, but the point is, the people of that cult were so welcoming. So welcoming. In fact, I think you should be a little hesitant anytime a community is that overly welcoming. That's the way Haight Street was. They were very, very welcoming. So Janis moves here as a real lost soul. She doesn't have friends. She doesn't have a purpose in life. She doesn't have a job. She's just trying to make it. And here she comes on to this scene where people are offering her shoes and shirts. And there's a store, the Free Store, where you can just go in and get anything for free. And she immediately felt so taken care of in that community. But at the same time, with that came a lot of drugs and a lot of those, depressed creatives who are just holding on to this pain, and they can't let go of this pain. They can't let go of this depression. They love it. They love to hurt, and that's not healthy. And that's what she found herself in again. But lucky for Janis, soon after moving to Haight Street, she was invited by a friend named Chet Helms to audition for a new band he was managing.
One time I hitchhiked from Austin to San Francisco with this guy, and then later, his name is Chet Helms. Later, he got involved in promoting the dances in San Francisco, and he was managing Big Brother, and he knew me from a long time ago in Texas, and he got me to come out and be with the band, and I just met him.
And this band was called Big Brother and the Holding Company. And little did Janis know, but this opportunity was going to change and save her life, at least for a few years. Under his management, Janis Joplin, Big Brother, and the Holding Company started gaining significant attention. For the majority of their first year, the band became a fixture, playing locally throughout the San Francisco music scene. And not just bars and clubs, although they did a lot of that, but they also played at the Avalon Ballroom and the Fillmore Auditorium. Some pretty good gigs, big gigs. They released an album in 1967 that wasn't really gaining a lot of traction, but in that same year of 1967, Janis and Big Brother performed at the Monterey Pop Festival. And it was at this festival, Big Brother realized how imperative Janis was to their success because the crowd absolutely loved Janis Joplin. In fact, after the Monterey Pop Festival, Big Brother went back and left their initial label. I'm blanking on who it was, but they left their initial label, went to Columbia Records, and Columbia Records re-released their 1967 album, this time putting Janis's name on the cover. Now, Janis hadn't written any songs on that album, but she did have vocals on it, and Big Brother realized after the Monterey Pop Festival how loved and adored she was. So they were thinking if we put her name on the cover, maybe our first album will do a little bit better, give it a little bit of the boost that it needs. But it didn't, but that's okay. Big Brother knew they were onto something good with Janis Joplin. So for their 1968 album, Cheap Thrills, they had Janis write a couple of the songs. She co-wrote I Need a Man to Love with Sam Andrew and wrote Turtle Blues, which was track number 5. Now, the last song on the album was her famous rendition of Ball and Chain. One night, Janis was sitting in a bar in San Francisco when she first heard the song Ball and Chain by Mama Thornton. And it was almost like the entire F. Scott Fitzgerald Zelda love affair was being sung in this song. It really left a lasting impression on Janis. After she left the bar, she took that song back to the Big Brother band and they transformed it into a slower, minor key kind of a blues song with multiple breaks. And Janis actually first sang this cover live at the Monterey Pop Festival. So this was before, they had been working on that next album, but she knew she wanted to cover it on the second album, and she had the right to do so now that she was working with Columbia Records. And one thing that actually makes me really mad is that Mama Thornton never received the royalty payments that she should have for her amazing songs. It's just something that plain old pisses me off. But I think it's so important to note that Ball and Chain was one of the first songs Janis Joplin goes live covering. And this was really the song that I think everyone saw in her something they'd never seen before. The song begins with a woman sitting by her window looking out at the rain. And at some point, she's just sitting there watching the raindrops fall when she is struck by this overwhelming memory of her ball and chain. And she goes into this total spiral of why, baby, why? Why must you do these mean things to me? I know you're gonna miss me, baby. Oh yes, you're going to miss all those sweet things. And then you'll find that your whole life will be like mine, oh Lord, wrapped up like a ball and chain. And the song ends with the singer convinced she is going to be in misery forever over this man. And in Mama Thornton's version, it's very soulful and blues-like, that's for sure. But then Janis takes it and they slow it down. She sprinkled in some screaming. Janis, in some ways, reminds me of Screamin Jay Hawkins. If you haven't seen my Roots documentary on Screamin Jay, he was really the father of shock rock. Everyone says Alice Cooper was with his spideyness, but Screamin Jay was really the one who paved the road for Alice Cooper and everybody else. And he would do these screams and cackles that just raised your heart rate in the best way possible. And it made you genuinely feel the song that was being played when he did that. You were no longer hearing the music when Screamin Jay sprinkled in those little cackles and screams. You weren't hearing the music anymore. You were genuinely feeling it, like in your bones. And that's what Janis Joplin did with Ball and Chain. Listening to Janis Joplin sing Ball and Chain was like listening to Ball and Chain for the very first time, no matter how many times you'd heard it before. And even if you had a perfectly happy life, a perfectly good husband, a perfectly fine marriage, you were crying about love gone wrong when you heard Janis sing this. And you can feel the soul and pain of F. Scott and Zelda in that rendition of that song. So it was only natural for that to be on the second album, and I thought it was very poetic and proper for it to be the last song on the album Cheap Thrills. The album Cheap Thrills was released in August of 1968 and was #1 on the Billboard Top 100 for 8 consecutive weeks. Critics praised the album for its raw yet powerful sound, and better than the album itself were the live performances by Janis. It was like if Screamin Jay met Tina Turner and their song child was Janis Joplin. Anyone who saw Janis perform live walked out of that concert a completely changed person from when they had walked in. It was like an out-of-body experience to see her. And after gaining all of this success and attention, Janis realized she could leave Big Brother and do this on her own. And that's exactly what she did. She formed a new band. She called them the Cosmic Blues. And they supported her vision of pursuing that mix of rock and roll and soul and blues. Her first solo album with them was released in September of 1969. And it actually received a few mixed reviews, but ultimately gained gold status. But for this year of 1969, she's really remembered by her performance at Woodstock. She actually opened and closed her Woodstock performance with cover songs. She opened the song with Raise Your Hand, which is a Steve Cropper song recorded by Floyd in 1967, their album Knock on Wood. And then she did an original from her solo album, As Good As You've Been to This World, followed by another cover by the Bee Gees. And then she ended with 2 cover songs from Cheap Thrills. All in all, exactly half of her set list at Woodstock were cover songs. And that's kind of what people loved about Janis, was that she could take a song that already existed and transform it into something, like I said, that you had never heard before, no matter how many times you'd heard the original. However, with all of this attention and this very hectic, chaotic schedule, Janis was also using a lot and drinking a lot. I think what people don't always recognize is that if you use and drink a lot, it literally changes the chemistry of your brain, okay? It makes you very moody, irritable. You have trouble building connections with people and making them last. It's actually crazy what mind-altering substances can do to your mind, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. And Janis was experiencing all of this. This led to Janis having a lot of really random, short, but intense relationships. And people kind of looked at Janis and looked at her choice of partners like, what? But she also had some pretty famous partners. Leonard Cohen, for example, and Janis Joplin had a famous little rendezvous together, which was the inspiration for Cohen's song, Chelsea Hotel No. 2. But probably the most stable relationship for Janis Joplin was her boyfriend David for a period of time. He always seemed to provide her with a sense of calm away from all the chaos, but ultimately that ended too. And the remainder of 1969, specifically for Janis, was incredibly busy for her. She was constantly doing interviews and traveling, and by the spring of 1970, Janis met her favorite partner to date, a man named Seth Morgan. Seth Morgan was a novelist and self-proclaimed dope dealer, and the two instantly hit it off. By the summer of 1970, the two of them were engaged, and Janis suddenly started talking about babies and having a family on interviews, a completely different tune than anyone had expected would come from her just a year prior. And it was in the late summer, going into early fall of 1970, Janis started to work on her next and what would be her final album, Pearl. Her recording sessions for Pearl were taking place at the Sunset Studios in LA. During these sessions, she would live at the Landmark Hotel for extended stays at a time. And I think that there's some confusion here about when she checked into the Landmark Hotel. In fact, there's a documentary out there that has, I think, 3 or 4 million views, and they say Janis checked into the hotel on October 3rd. And within 30 minutes would be dead, or like something like that. And that's simply not true. First of all, that doesn't make sense with the timeline of her recording at Sunset Studios. And maybe there's confusion because she was going back and forth between Sunset Studios and her home in Beverly Hills. And so she wasn't at one place the entire time. She had an apartment, like a second home at the Landmark Hotel for several months at a time for these recording sessions. In 1970, her very first check-in at the hotel was August 24th. She recorded the famous song Me and Bobby McGee on September 5th, 1970, and Mercedes-Benz was the last song she recorded in these sessions before her death. That recording took place on October 1st, 1980. Interestingly enough, also on October 1st, just 3 days before her death, Janis filed her will for the very first time in the Marin County Superior Court. I just think that is beyond spooky and gosh, just one of those things in music history where you're just like, oh boy. Now, there aren't specific details about what she did on October 2nd, so it's safe to say that October 2nd, 1970 was just a normal day for her. At some point, Janis reached out to a dealer to get some. It's unclear when, but that would be a decision that would end her life. Now, according to the documentary that I just spoke about that has millions of views and incorrectly says she checked in on October 3rd, according to that, okay, this is what they say happened. They said on October 3rd, she ordered a bunch of from a and that she knew and trusted the dealer, which I haven't seen that confirmed anywhere. That what she didn't realize, and what the dealer probably didn't realize, was that the batch of was extremely potent and pure. Then they say after buying this, she went back to the studio to do some work, and later that evening, and they do get this right, she did for sure on October 3rd go to a local bar called Barney's Beanery. Her last known interaction was a phone call she made when she got back to the Landmark Hotel on October 3rd. She called her bandmate and friend John Cook, and she was calling him to arrange a visit to the studio the following day. And then, according to this documentary, that's when she reaches for she shot herself up in her room and then decided to go down to the lobby to ask for change for the cigarette machine. The man behind the desk gave her some change. She got some cigarettes, went back upstairs, and according to this documentary, she started to undress and then fell. So that's another detail that seems to be untrue based on the newspaper articles and based on what the witnesses on scene said they saw. It wasn't until October 5th her death made headlines nationwide. One newspaper said she had been estimated to have been dead about 2 hours before she was found. Another said 12. But I think it's 2 because John Cook said he was worried that night when he came back from the bar and saw her car parked outside, but she wasn't answering the telephone. He said he opened the door and he found her body, quote, wedged between the bed and a nightstand. And he said she was wearing a short nightgown, which means, according to the documentary that has all those millions of views, she didn't just start undressing and then collapse. She fully changed into her pajamas. So that means it's completely possible she could have been asleep and gotten up and fell, or just rolled over, possibly. You know, rolling over probably seems the more realistic option than getting up and falling, because she was found wedged between the bed and the nightstand, which indicates she could have been laying down and rolled over. Now, Police Sergeant Ed Sanchez was on duty that night with the Hollywood Police Department, and he was one of the first to speak on scene. He said, quote, "The singer had numerous needle marks on her left forearm, but that they appeared to be 2 to 14 days old." He also said no drugs or paraphernalia, I can't say that word right, were found in the room. The only thing he and his team said they found in the room, this is the moment she was found, was tequila, vodka, and wine. It said this in multiple sources too on October 5th, where the reporters were speaking directly with the police on scene. So eyebrows were raised when later in October, it was 2.5, 3 weeks later, her autopsy was revealed, showing she had died from a overdose. Reports then started changing, and then the newspapers started reporting that there was paraphernalia found on scene. In fact, they said there was a whole kit in there. The coroner stated she had fresh needle marks on her left arm, which contradicted what those on scene described as marks that were 2 to 14 days old. If you want to know what I think, which no one has asked for my opinion, but I'm just going to give it, I think she probably shot up in her car and then went inside to the hotel room. I don't think more than one police officer would have the wrong information about what was found there the moment that it was happening. But either way, everyone started reporting that there were just everywhere and all these false reports. But the autopsy confirmed she had died by a hot shot, which means it's just, I was going to say a million times, but not a million times, maybe like 50% stronger than your usual dose. So they did a whole psychological evaluation on Janis and her life and where she was with things when she died. And they determined this was accidental. She did not mean to overdose. This was not a she was actually very happy at this time in her life. She loved the way Pearl was coming together. She loved her fiance. She was so excited to start a life with him. And like I said, 3 days before her death, she had filed that will. She gave her whole estate to her mom and her dad and her siblings, which just speaks volumes to how much she loved her family and honored her upbringing. You know, she gave an interview once where she was talking about how all of her high school friends had bullied her and she had such a hard time in high school and hated it. And she said she was going to go back to her high school reunion to just kind of like shove it in people's faces. Like, look at what I've done. Look at, aren't you sorry that you were mean to me? You know, that kind of a thing. And she went to her high school reunion with that attitude. And people there said once she got there, she softened up quite a bit and had this very humble, almost sorry persona to her, where she felt badly that she had planned to come in and just kind of be a jerk. And it ended up being a really like soft and humbling reunion for her. It wasn't her going in like, haha, fuck you, like the way she had kind of planned to have that attitude. And I think that's just her overall theme and what a lot of people misunderstand about her. She was very sensitive. She would say something sassy or she would say something snarky, and then she'd question it and say, did that sound mean? You know, because I don't want it to be mean, but that's just kind of like how I feel. And I think another thing people might misunderstand about her is her relationships. So yes, she had well-known relationships with well-known, respected people and with some not so respected people. You know, I could be wrong about it. I really could. Really, really could. Because this is one fact I really didn't look into. But I think she only had one fling with another female. You know, people are like, oh, she was sleeping with women and all these one-night stands. And I mean, she was in her 20s, you know, so, but all these one-night stands. But I don't think she had that many one-night stands. First of all, she had like a few people for sure, maybe like probably more than the average person, but she was also a rock star. But she also, I think, only had one relationship with a female. It was a woman named Peggy. And if not, I mean, it's definitely the most well-known relationship. And Peggy ended up writing a book about it, and it was called like My Downward Spiral with Janis or something like, or The Decline with Janis or something to that effect. She wrote a book about that. But it seems like that was just a really brief thing that, I mean, I'm not justifying it, but it did just seem like a very brief thing that happened to Janis in the middle of an episode where she was using very heavily. And I think people put more weight on that relationship she had with Peggy than should be put on that. I think she was just using, she was out of her mind, it happened, and Peggy like latched onto it. I mean, it was like Peggy's 15 minutes of fame, you know, being with this rock star. I don't know. You know, who knows like what even happened? Who even knows what actually happened? But she was very sensitive and she would question things and she did care what you thought about her. She actually did. You know, she said in an interview once, they said something about, you know, why don't you ever tour with women? People are asking, why don't you ever tour with women on the road? And I'm just unfiltered, says, because I don't like women. And she's like, I don't want to be around women. I'd rather be around men. And I think then she kind of questioned it and was like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I don't want it to sound offensive. I don't want it to sound mean. And it was just kind of word vomit that came out of her. And then she felt really bad about it and was questioning how that was going to make her look and how people were going to receive what she just said. But I think what she was thinking and trying to say was probably she was bullied by girls her whole life in high school. Girls were very mean to her. They called her a man, an ugly man, the ugliest man at that. So why would you trust females? How could you trust females if you had been bullied like that? And I was actually talking to someone the other day and she said this to me and she said, I don't have a lot of female friends. And she said, because I was really bullied in school. And I just feel better around guys because the guys were never mean to me. And I get it. And that was Janis too. She knew that she couldn't continue on with the habits that she had. She was going through, you know, a whole thing of Southern Comfort on a single show. And she knew she couldn't sustain a life that way. But I don't think she realized that it could kill her so young, so soon. She died at 27 years old, just like many other artists, unfortunately, do, who were part of the 27 Club at that time. But her legacy lives on. And to this day, people hear her sing Me and Bobby McGee, or Mercedes-Benz, or Ball and Chain. And after hearing a Janis Joplin song, you are a changed person. She was, without a doubt, an extremely resilient person as a human and as a performer. It took her 3 times moving to California before anything good happened to her. And she had the wherewithal to say, you know, music saved me. She refers to that moment when she moved on Haight Street and she just says, if it weren't for the music, if it weren't for Chet and the music, I would have ruined myself. And in a lot of ways, she admits that she was constantly ruining herself and she was the reason for her own demise. And everything came together for her. And she had been saying that for years, but everything came together for her in 1970 when Nancy Milford released the biography of Zelda. It was like unlocking Pandora's box of secrets for Janis Joplin. It was like that biography of Zelda that Milford wrote was like cracking Janis Joplin's Da Vinci Code of the world. And she was in love with that biography. If you haven't read it, it is an incredible read, and I will link it in the description down below. I am also going to link all of the letters between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, because I think it's so important. If you didn't know that about Janis Joplin, now you do. I think if you read those letters between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, it will forever change your interpretation of Janis Joplin's music. You can listen to a Janis Joplin song and it can be good. And you can feel it in your bones, you know, the way Screamin Jay and Tina Turner together, like that magic, that je ne sais quoi you can feel. But if you read the letters between Fitzgerald and Zelda and understand Janis Joplin's fascination and immersion in that story, in that love story, that's going to change Janis Joplin for you forever in the best way possible. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to subscribe and like the video, the thumbs up button. You have no idea how much it helps just to have one extra subscriber and thumbs up on a video. It pushes the video up in the YouTube algorithm so that more people can see it and appreciate the content and hear the stories. And I want to thank everyone who is a member of the Roots Music History family, anyone who has bought me a coffee or given me a super thanks. It means so much more to me than you will ever know. And I am having the time of my life building this community with you guys and seeing all of the comments and making these videos really an open discussion thread. That's really my goal with this. So it's an open conversation, even though it seems one-sided because there's a camera and I'm just talking. This is an open conversation and the other side of it is in the comments. So thank you so much for sharing memories and thoughts. I read everything and I try to respond to everything, but it's not always possible. But I'm having the time of my life and thank you so much for being here. I hope you're having fun too. And I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.